The attack on October 7th was so vile, so tragic, so depraved, so evil, that it should have sparked international sympathy and solidarity. And make no mistake, it did, initially. But that support and solidarity wore off very, very quickly. Within days, we had comments coming in saying, Israel actually deserved this. If you abuse a dog for long enough and that dog turns around and bites you, who's to blame? And then my own personal favorite, October 7th, never happened. Israel staged it. October 7th was the worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. And in the decades after the Holocaust, we've spoken so many times about how could it happen? How did people just stand idly by? And then, when October 7th happened, instead of doing better, instead of being there for our brothers and sisters, what happened was a volcano, a floodgate of vile anti-Semitism just erupting from where it seemed to have been bubbling below the surface and covered by a thin veneer of platitudes and smiles. Maybe we shouldn't have been surprised, but to be honest, I was shocked to the core. Didn't we learn from history? And maybe the short answer is no. But we can't leave it at that. So, here today, to help us walk through that tragic aftermath of anti-Semitism in the wake of October 7th, is Neil Lazarus. Neil, welcome. Neil is an internationally acclaimed commentator and educator in the fields of Middle Eastern politics, public diplomacy, and effective communication training. He addresses a whopping 30,000 people annually, including Christian, Muslim, and Jewish groups who seek a deeper insight and understanding into this tiny strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River that is just perpetually in the international limelight. Now, Neil is one of Israel's leading keynote educators, and his audience includes legal experts, diplomats, community professionals, and journalists. And he's often one of the first to call to explain the complexity of this region in the media and to foreign audiences. Neil hails from Britain, and he immigrated to Israel in 1988 after earning a BA in politics and Russian studies from the University of Wales. He also holds a master's degree in political science from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Neil, let's dive right into it. But before we get started, I'd like to ask you, there's a number of definitions about anti-Semitism. Everyone has a definition of that, and there are a number of accepted definitions, but we don't want to get academical today. I want to ask you, as someone on the receiving end of anti-Semitism, what does it mean to you, to your family, to your people? What is it?
It's not a complicated question. It's hating Jews and negating their history, or having a double standard towards them.
Right.
I mean, we often get this ridiculous argument from Muslims that I'm a Semite, so I can't be anti-Semitic. Right. So let's call it as it is. It's the hatred of Jews because they are Jews, and the association of historic tropes towards them. And a negation of the connection of the Jewish people with their historic roots, the State of Israel.
Correct, because now we get a very popular thing where obviously you're not anti-Semitic, not at all. Everyone who goes out to march, they're not anti-Semitic. They are simply anti-Zionist.
Well, there's a legitimate, you can legitimately criticize the government of the State of Israel. Of in Israel, we always joke, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. In Israel, we have 2 Israelis, 4 opinions, 5 political parties, and change of government every other year. Mm-hmm. So that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is something much more basic. It's a calling for either the destruction of the State of Israel, not recognizing that Israel's right to exist as a country, which is a democratic country for the Jewish people. It's the use of historic tropes of where often Israel is described in the terms that Jews once were, all-empowering, eating Christian flesh. We just had that. You're joking. You think I'm joking. We just had that in Gaza, this idea of Israel stealing body parts. I mean, it's blood libel. Many of the tropes that we're seeing today are not new. They go back to the Middle Ages to describe Jews. Today it's less politically correct, although we hear it, of the open hatred of Jews as such. So they reword it. And there's the doublespeak, and the doublespeak is now Israel. Israel is held in a position where Jews once were.
Right. Correct. It's insane. It just hit me about a week or so ago that hundreds of years ago, the Jews poisoned the wells. Now, these days, it's just Israel doing it.
Right. So that replacement in the dialogue, I think, is something which is very important. And you can go... description of the Jews historically now being used towards Israel.
Indeed.
The Jews were all control the world. Today it's AIPAC. Okay. AIPAC is not that powerful. It didn't stop the American government doing a deal with Iran. Okay. The Jews control the media. We wish. It reminds me of that joke where the rabbi is reading the Nazi Times on the London Underground, and one of his students comes up and meets him reading the Nazi Times. He goes, Rabbi, why are you reading the Nazi Times? He says, when I read the regular newspapers, life is terrible. But when I read the Nazi Times, we control the media, we control the banks, and we control everything. It's those stereotypes. They're not new, but today it's Israel controlling it, and the Jews who support Israel supporting it.
So what you're telling me is we're looking at thousands of years of anti-Semitism just repeating itself over and over again, and every generation just a new face?
Yes. But there's a difference. Today we have the State of Israel. What the story of October the 7th was that the State of Israel failed to prevent a pogrom within the State of Israel itself. That's the historic element here. In other words, anti-Semitism emerges every time there's a crisis, whether it's a health crisis, whether it's an economic crisis, that anti-Semitism is here. Today's a crisis within the Middle East, the anti-Semitism emerges. It emerges in different forms. Okay. The question is that today, unlike the past, Israel exists to protect the Jewish people. Some people you always hear, we have Israel because of the Holocaust. It's the wrong way around. We have the Holocaust because there wasn't an Israel.
Right.
The story of October the 7th was that the State of Israel and the army did not prevent a pogrom taking place, and that in Israel today, we have displaced Israelis within Israel. That's the challenge and the legacy of October the 7th, which I think we're still in that process of trying to reconcile. But anti-Semitism exists because the Jew has always historically been the scapegoat of people around the world.
And that's an interesting question, because we can sit here for hours and hours to discuss the root of anti-Semitism. Do you want to give it a stab?
When we have if you go back in history, you can see anti-Semitism emerges. There's different combinations. We have Christian anti-Semitism with the belief of Jews killing Jesus. So hold on, if you kill Jesus, you are, which again, it's not all Christians, it's not all Muslims, it's not all that. Right? But they pick on that trope. If you kill Jesus, you're the Antichrist. You're the devil. The stereotype of Jews as the devil, you can see historically. Now, here's the frightening one. I gave a seminar to a group of university students, Jewish students, this year. And I asked, put your hands up, how many of you have been asked whether you have horns before? Students in America, at least 2, put up their hands. That's how bad it is in some areas of the United States, for example. So this idea of, and again, don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying that every Christian is anti-Semitic, I'm not saying every Muslim is anti-Semitic, but the tropes within anti-Semitism exist. Jews as money lenders, remember, comes from the medieval times. So every Jew is seen as perceived as remarkably wealthy. I wish. You have the idea of blood libel, the idea of Jews eating Christian babies or taking the blood of Christians. It goes back to medieval times. We have Al Jazeera reporting, God bless them, that Israel is digging up the graves of Gaza and taking out body parts. That's blood libel. That's blood libel.
Like,
And we've had, it's not the first time we've seen.
body parts?
Yeah, and we've seen that. Organ harvesting.
Yeah, but it's buried bodies, so it's
So they're digging up the cemeteries. I mean, these are the allegations that go on. And when you see this, it's not, okay, I've seen this before. The denial. When I saw for the first time, not just the horror of the atrocity of October the 7th, but the horror that people were denying it. It reminded me of Holocaust denial. And it took weeks upon weeks for the United Nations to recognize rape being used by Hamas members as a weapon of war. Where in the world, when a woman says, I've been raped, do people turn around and say, I just don't believe you? No. Prove it. Prove it.
But here's the thing. Holocaust denial took years, decades.
But the mentality is the same.
The denial of October 7th took days.
Right. And why? Because everything's becoming faster.
Right.
In other words, in the history, we used to have a man on a horse delivering a letter. Then suddenly, the revolution of Russia, they introduced film for the first time, right? Communication changes. Think about how people get their news today. Today, people are getting their news from their phone. I did an exercise where I asked a class, how many of you watch the 8 o'clock news? And anyone over 30 did. Anyone under 30 get their news from social media. That's a game changer.
Right.
And more than that, the issue of social media is there's no censor.
Indeed.
So you can have fake news.
Truth becomes whatever you make it to be.
100%.
Now,
it's Orwellian.
History, literally, I'm looking back over the decades, years, millennia of anti-Semitism. Do we not learn from history, and why?
We do learn from history, and the thing that we learn from history is if someone says they want to kill you, believe them and stop.
But it seems like we don't, because everywhere in the world I see denial. I see, well, Israel is at fault. So you might have learned from history, but why have we, and again, not all of us, but why has the Western world not learned? Why does anti-Semitism continue? Why isn't
because
it?
Because anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred. And it exists because it's the most convenient scapegoat for a wide range of groups, whether it's the progressives, whether it's the far right, whether it's the far left, whether it's Islamic, all right? That's the anti-Semitism which exists today.
So it's just
and they ally with each other. So often you'll see the far left using the tropes of the far right, and this mixture of language where progressives side with Islamic fundamentalists, like
this weird marriage of just
crazy.
Right.
The production of this investigative series is made possible by the generous donations of Christians from around the world. You can also make a difference by supporting this initiative. We want you to share, to give, and be a voice so that we can produce more series like this. The truth about what is happening here in Israel and around the world must be told, and it must go out. Please click on the link to donate.
Now, what to be done? I've heard my entire life, education, education, education. And we see that everywhere. However, judging by the past 4 months, education is not enough.
I agree with you. I think there's 4 major elements. 1, redlining. What do I mean by redlining? Is you have to be able to say, that's anti-Semitic, that's wrong. You have to be able to define it and stand by it. And one of the interesting things, again, working with university students, working with particularly Jewish groups, I ask them a question. What is your red line on your campus? You know what they say? There's an awkward silence in the room.
There's none.
They don't, and it's new, there is inability to define what my red line on anti-Semitism is. And I have a theory which is, If someone is in an abusive relationship, the tragedy of the abusive relationship is that the person who's being abused doesn't recognize the abuse. And they always say, if I just change, he's going to be okay. And what we're seeing is a generation of university students today who are actually in an abusive relationship because of their Jewish identity. And they are unable to actually recognize it as abuse. They know that they're not comfortable. They know that it's awkward. They know it hurts when they're hit. Sorry to go too far on that analogy. But how to get out of it, how to respond to it, is very problematic. So sometimes I think it's important for communities, the adult organizations, and etc., to help redline. So
Hang on, before we get to the red line of anti-Semitism, a question there. Very popular these days, and we've addressed it, but anti-Zionism. Now, the merging of those two, I feel like, yes, we discussed that it's okay to criticize. However, when anti-Zionism just become a more politically correct way of saying anti-Semitism, and a comment I got on social media was, oh, we don't hate the awesome Jews, just the Zionist ones.
That's anti-Semitic. That's anti-Semitic.
So
I
how do we address that?
wouldn't, as someone who's not Christian, try to define your reality with Jesus. I can't. I'm not Christian.
Yeah.
Right? Many people can't define for a woman, if I'm not a woman, what sexism is. All right? But everyone wants to define their anti-Semitism. When a Jew says, that's anti-Semitic, I feel awkward, I don't feel comfortable. If they can, then we have to start listening. That's number one. So this idea of someone else saying, I'm not anti-Semitic, I like good Jews, that's anti-Semitic. Yeah, Jews are good and Jews are bad. Well, so is everybody else.
Right.
Two, you got to educate. So we said redlining. Second of all, I need you to educate. What does that mean? Is you can say something which is anti-Semitic and not be an anti-Semite. And sometimes people may say something like that, but they have to, if you can, have that conversation of, well, actually, that's pretty offensive.
Give me an example.
Whoopi Goldberg, okay? Love her. Great fun.
Yeah.
But I think it was Nun Story. She did a brilliant. Anyway.
Sister Act.
Sister Act.
Yes.
Loved it.
Oh, it was
so
great.
good. So, like, good woman. I don't think he gets Whoopi. We all love Whoopi. But what she comes out with, recognized it and then repeated it, is often very anti-Semitic. When she talks about the Holocaust, when she allies the Holocaust with her own idea, it just doesn't work. So again, I think you can say something which is anti-Semitic and not be an anti-Semite. Correct. If you're willing to change. In other words, it's like, okay, I didn't realize, I apologize, I didn't mean to offend, that's where I come from. All's good. It's when they continue with it, then I have bigger problems. Third element, allying. In other words, and this is where we're talking, we're Christian friends, Jewish friends, Muslim friends, anyone who's against hatred. There's so much hatred in the world. I'm sure that this isn't God's intention, right? Is where we can ally against hatred and bring communities together. That's got to be good. And the last one, again, depending where you are, but especially on the American audience, is litigate. Is take legal action. And what we're seeing, for example, on campuses such as Harvard and elsewhere, were successes where funds are taken out, there's threats of litigation. So redlining, educating, allying, and litigation.
What has changed? We look at this insane history. How does it make you feel to know that it's been like that? It might possibly never change.
That reassures my belief in the need for the State of Israel.
Yeah.
What needs to change is a introspection within the State of Israel about what went wrong. And we've seen the Chief of Staff doing that. We've seen the head of the intelligence done that. We also need the political echelons to have introspection and say, we failed, let's fight the war, and then something's going to happen. And I think that will happen in Israel. I think that we're at a turning point in history in Israel. Look, some people compare it to the Yom Kippur War.
Right.
It's inaccurate to some extent. The October the 7th war is the longest war Israel has fought since the War of Independence. The Yom Kippur War was a battle between two countries, or armies rather, and they weren't the civilians and they weren't the hostages. But the one thing I think we will see, and maybe it's too early to predict, is the political change that happens afterwards. Is because of the 73 war, ultimately, we had the turnaround in Israeli elections in 1977 and a change of values, of leadership, of system. And I think that that's going to happen in Israel as well. Many of the people are now looking for answers. Once the war's finished, and we're not there yet, we have to see what happens in the north, is questions about, it reinforces, if you like, the need for Israel, a secure Israel. And we need to answer the one question, which is what went wrong.
Yeah. Interesting. It's going to be an interesting year, interesting 2 years. Which brings me to my last question. As Christians, we often we're individuals. For me, in South Africa, in Japan, New Zealand, Australia, we have one voice. How do we use it? What do you want to see from us? How can we make a difference practically?
In one sentence, stand by Israel.
How? What does it look like practically?
So there's many things that churches and community leaders who are perhaps listening can do. One, support the Jewish community locally. Two, practically raise funds, bring over goods, and ally with Bridges for Peace and other organizations who take what's necessary and really on the ground and provide the needs of people who've now become homeless, etc., etc. Politically, stand for Israel and to say out loud that this, as believing Christians, we are against anti-Semitism. This is anti-Semitic, and we have to fight it. Lobby in support of the state of Israel. And you know what? Sometimes, just sometimes, it's just listen and be there. For many Jewish communities, they're very much connected to Israel. They have family in Israel, and we're going through a period of trauma. And sometimes it's just that small call. You know, you pick up the phone, you say, are you okay? Are you all right? Is there something I can do? That can be enough as well. But it's being there, being together with the Jewish people and supporting Israel as the one holy land for Christian Jews and Muslims around the world.
Absolutely. Well, it's often said that this is Israel's Holocaust. This is Israel's modern Holocaust. Never again.
It's not Israel's Holocaust because we have Israel.
Indeed.
And we have a place to go, and we have a government which will and does. Maybe we can criticize it for not enough, but we have a place that we can call home. The Jews of the Holocaust didn't have that. So it's not a Holocaust, but it is a tragedy and something which needs to be resurrected, to correct it.
There's a difference too. During the Holocaust, the Christians were mostly silent. This time, we are not. We are speaking. We are with you. You are not alone. So there's good news and there's bad news. Bad news first. History is on repeat. The cycle of the ages is repeating itself, and the Jewish people, once again, the easy scapegoat, the one to blame for everything. But there's a difference, and that difference is you and me. The Jewish people will not face those accusations without a champion. We will be right alongside them, answering the lies. Anti-Semitism does not have a place in the church any longer. And that's why we're here. That's why you are here. That's why I am here. Together, we stand with Israel. I'm Israel Chai.